Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have Bryan Boorstein back on our just every couple month check in, just see how things are going, but also obviously talk about some hypertrophy stuff. Bryan, welcome back on the podcast, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm just trying to keep up with Jordan and be on more times than him.
I guess we'll have to tally that up and see where we're at there with it.
Yeah,
But yeah, no, man. Yeah, I did the, hey, who do you want to see come on the podcast? And you were up there at least a couple times, obviously. And now you do my programming and coach me. So it's now we got to definitely get you on here more
for
regularly.
sure. Yeah, glad to come hang, man.
Cool. First thing we wanted to talk about was I had Milo Wolf on. I can't remember what episode it was. And towards the end, he said, we talked about long muscle length training and stuff that he's doing around there with that and the research. And he mentioned that you potentially had he called it like misapplication around it. And I know you talked to him about and everything. So I just wanted to give you a chance to give your thoughts on it and things like that. So yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, misapplication's an interesting word. I think that the way he phrased it was that the way that I do them is not evidence-based, talking about length and partials. And so the interesting thing about something being evidence-based is that it has to be studied in the evidence in research for it to be evidence-based. And so if they've never studied doing partials the way that I do them, then there's no way that could be evidence-based. But what I think is really interesting about this whole topic is that part of, or the main, I guess, not to put words in his mouth, but to me, it seemed like the main portion of his argument for why he prefers to do length and partials the way that he does, and I do them the way I do them. And I'll explain his way in a second. But was that with his way, you can use RIR, you can use proximity to failure, and therefore you can take sets to 3 reps from failure or 2 reps from failure or whatever. And so that was part of the rationale for him saying that my way wasn't evidence-based, was because it essentially is a past failure way of approaching length and reps. So the way he does them is essentially he establishes a range of motion cutoff point, say 60% of the range of motion. For an example, you might say you're doing a leg curl, and you know that the shortened part of the leg curl as your heels approach your butt is potentially less stimulative than the lengthened range of the leg curl. So he would just do his leg curl by going to 60% of the way to his heels touching his butt and then release and go back down and back up. And essentially, in the case of the leg curl, this would allow you to use more weight because you're avoiding what is essentially the hardest part of the movement. In the case of the leg curl, the hardest part of the movement is also the least stimulative part. Conversely, if you're looking at this in relation to an RDL, which has the opposite resistance profile of a leg curl, where it's hardest at the bottom, he would perform his RDLs by going down to the bottom where it's stretched and then probably come back up just until the bar is maybe at his kneecaps or slightly above his kneecaps and then descend back down again. In the example of that movement, he would actually be using less weight because the part that he's omitting is the easiest part of the movement. So like when you're standing at the top of an RDL, there's no tension there, nothing's happening. He's essentially making that movement more difficult by staying in the length and range. So on a leg curl, you can use more weight doing it his way. On an RDL, you're using less weight doing it that way. But essentially, regardless, the point is that his way allows you to use RIR and be a little bit further from failure because you've just established a new range of motion. The way that I do partials that I've discussed on your podcast and my podcast and a number of other places is I generally only do them on short overload movements. So I would only do them on the leg curl. I wouldn't do them on the RDL, and I would do them after failure. So I would do the full range of motion reps until I could no longer touch my heels to my butt in the leg curl. And then I would just gradually allow that range of motion to drop off as the fatigue increased. Essentially, in my opinion, more thoroughly fatiguing the full spectrum of the muscle. So in Milo's way, you're essentially targeting the lengthened range, but you're really only fatiguing the point where you stop. So if you're setting a 60% range of motion stop, you're really only failing or getting close to failure at that point of the range of motion. But what about like 50%, 40%, 30%, 20%, and 10%, like all the way down until there's no range of motion left? That range seems to be left understimulated, would be the way I would say it. That's a basic back argument. And then just very recently, we had this cool meta regression come out from the guys at Data Driven Strength, Zach and Josh. And this meta regression showed pretty clearly, for what it can show, that training closer to failure provides you a more hypertrophic stimulus than training further from failure, and that it increases almost linearly as you get closer to failure. And so with that That occurred after my conversation with Milo, after he was on your podcast. I would need to have another conversation with him again to see if maybe that's changed his opinion at all about the way that I do partials, given that one of his biggest critiques was that I do them to failure and pass failure. Anyway, that's just my interpretation of our disagreement, and feel free to ask any questions or whatever from there.
Yeah, it sounded like really the biggest thing was it hadn't been done in the research. And then he also combined it with the fact about the training to failure aspect of it. And that's why he said it's misapplied from like the length and partial research that is out there right now. And that was the main thing there with it. But now obviously you're saying, and I think me and you talked about this too, the big thing with fatigue and training to failure is also that you obviously have to alter your training volume, and paying attention to how you're performing and like recovering is also going to be super important in that process too.
Yeah, that's one of the big things that I think gets lost in this failure versus non-failure conversation, because like people are constantly saying, why would you train to failure when you can get just as good results 2 reps from failure or 3 reps from failure? But no one ever includes the caveat that you need to do more volume of further from failure work. And so if I can do 2 sets to failure or potentially beyond failure, instead of having to do 4 to 5 sets at 2 or 3 reps from failure, to me, that just seems good return on my time, good opportunity cost. As a busy guy, as most people are, even if it was more optimal, which I'm not sure the meta regression would even insinuate, but even if it was more optimal to train at 4 or 5 sets further from failure, I don't think there's too many people with a real life and responsibilities and stuff that would say, yeah, I'll just do double the volume so that I can train a few reps shy of failure.
I also wondered too, I think that might be a better, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Would you do any of this again, like the way that you had me training and how, because we talked about you did switch it up just a little bit, but the way you had it, would you do that with somebody that's like a little bit more of a beginner, like intermediate, or is that like strictly, hey, I would only wait to do this till somebody's like more advanced? Because I have a couple thoughts, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on it first.
You mean specific to like the lengthened bias stuff?
Length and bias stuff, but then also like doing the partials after failure, essentially.
Yeah. No, I don't think it's necessary for somebody novice. Intermediate is a really large range. Like intermediate can span from a year of training to 10 years of training. So intermediate is very broad. And I think that there's certainly rationale for using it in the latter stages of your intermediate time. One use case that I think has been extremely helpful for my group programs at Paragon and Evolved is the use of these partials after failure as simply a way of people assessing whether they're actually going to failure. So the way that I generally program this stuff on short overload movements, and this would be like our leg curl, our row, our leg extension, pull downs, stuff like that, is I'll generally program 1 set to failure, and then you'll rest a few minutes and you'll add weight. So you'll add 20% weight to whatever you did on the last set, and then you have to match the amount of reps that you achieved on the prior set. But because you added 20% weight, if you went to failure for 10 reps on the prior set, you shouldn't be able to get more than 3 or 4 reps with 20% more weight. But what we're seeing in the group with novice people or intermediates is that they're adding 20% and then they're still getting the same amount of reps that they were getting on the prior set when they thought they were at failure. And so just as a shit test for yourself, partials after failure have been huge. Same thing with lateral raises. We're constantly seeing people being like I'll be like, go to failure and then do 6 partials. And they're like, oh, I did my 6 partials, but they were full reps. And I'm like, so you weren't actually at failure. So there has been an extremely successful use case in that example. And then I think as far as actually using it as a stimulus, yeah, I would generally gravitate more toward intermediate or beyond.
That was my thought on it, and where I think it could be helpful. And to go back to this like failure talk is, let's be honest, most people probably stay far away. Like I feel like they probably stay too far away from failure most of the time. And again, if they do get close to failure, I feel like their technique is garbage, and that's obviously an issue. So like I feel like it can be useful, and this is why I asked if you could use it for people that were maybe not necessarily advanced, but I would imagine that people who are newer to training, early intermediates, they're going to be the ones that probably stay far away from failure. So it's like a good way to help them get to that point to actually get close to failure. And plus they're not like super advanced. So it's like the fatigue aspect, the fatigue cost of going closer to failure is probably a little bit less. So that's my thought on it, but yeah, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, it's basically a way to help them calibrate their diagnostics, which once, as we all know, once you experience what failure is, you're going to be much more successful at predicting different proximities to failure from there. If you don't know what failure is, it's really hard to ever actually be there.
Yeah. And again, too, with the fatigue aspect of it, wouldn't you say that would be more something that you would worry about with somebody that is more advanced, they're doing more weight. And so it's like for them, going closer to failure is probably a little bit more like something that you do want to manage and look at the fatigue cost of it.
Yeah, the fatigue is certainly going to be lower for a new person. And most of that is just due to the fact that they don't really even have the capability to exert maximal force at times. Like you've done in-person coaching before, yeah, personal training. So this is always an example I use is for us more like intermediate advanced people, we use concentric rep speed as an assessment of how close you are to failure, right? So if you do 8 reps and they're all 1 second up, then you're like, cool, you're still far from failure. And then as you get closer to failure, it's 2 seconds, 2.5 seconds, 3.5 seconds. Okay, failure. When you watch a new person say squat, they can misgroove reps so often that they could be like, oh, misgroove slow. And then you're like, oh, okay, you're close to failure, right?
Nope.
And then they go down and then they shoot back up and you're like, whoa, what was that? So there's just so much neural learning going on and just so many factors that go into the execution of reps as a novice that it's almost like fatigue is a non-issue because there's just so much neural connectivity going on. Like they're just learning and figuring it out.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. As you were saying that, I'm like, oh man, looking back on a lot of clients, I remember that where it's, oh crap, all right, I got it in their set now. And then it's like the next 2 squats were like easier. That doesn't make sense. But yeah, no, it's funny that because I've seen that so many times. Cool. So I guess then, is there anything else that you want to add to the comment, or was there anything that maybe we skipped over on it? I feel pretty good.
No, that's good, man. Yeah, I think we discussed that pretty well.
Cool. So let's dive into, okay, so now you mentioned that you did change things a little bit with like my training. So I feel like this is a good time to kind of transition into that. And maybe you want to hit on your training and some changes that you made there with that based on all this information.
Yeah. So with your training, we're actually in a specialization phase right now, which I know is the focus of this podcast. There's obviously a number of different levers that we can pull with specialization and ways to prioritize different muscle groups and stuff like that. So I'll save like the good meat of that for the latter discussion. But with you, we're focusing on like back, lats, and delts for the most part. And then we're not ignoring the arms. If anything, we're probably putting the legs as a unit on the back burner just a little bit. But even with that, we're still training the legs twice a week. The chest is also not a priority. And so there's one day that really hammers the chest, and then one day where it gets hit as an accessory kind of on the incline anterior delt presses. But overall, like we're really pulling the card on frequency for the most part right now with your program and hitting the back and delt stuff 3 times a week. And it seems as if we're managing it pretty well because your recovery is chugging right along. Check-ins seem pretty solid week to week. And I guess one thing to note in your program is that we're actually starting to experiment with some of the way that Milo Wolf does the lengthened partials. So after I went on that big discussion in the beginning about I do it this way and Milo does it that way, at the end of the day, like I think that there is utility in using both approaches, and it really is dependent on the movement. So one thing I've been somewhat vocal about, and I feel not as strongly as I did at one point about it, but I've always said that doing partials, like lengthened partials on a movement that is already lengthened overloaded is redundant. And so the example there would be like the RDL that I discussed, or like on a hack squat or something like that. So picture on a hack squat, you're essentially going to go all the way to the bottom until your knees are super flexed. And then you're just going to come back up just past parallel. And then you would change direction and go back down again. And so I said it was redundant. And I do still feel in many ways that doing them that way is redundant. And so I haven't included these yet for these big compound movements, the hack or the leg press or the RDL, et cetera. But what we've started doing, both in my own training and in your training now, has been to introduce the Milo Wolf way, the official evidence-based way, onto some single joint movements that happen to be lengthened overloaded. And so the examples specifically would be the different variations of face away curls that we do, the different variations of cross cable tricep extensions or overhead tricep extensions, as well as on the dual cable lateral raise, which I've recently introduced for myself. And then I've also personally been using this approach on hip extension, 45-degree hip extension, and on leg extensions. And so leg extensions and hip extensions are different than the other movements because they're short overloaded, meaning they're hardest at the top. In those examples, I'm actually able to use more weight because I'm cutting off the range of motion that's the hardest but least stimulative. Whereas for the movements that we're doing, like the face away curl and the overhead tricep extensions and the dual cable lateral raise, I'm actually finding that I'm using either slightly less weight or the same weight as I would for the full range of motion reps, because the range of motion that we're cutting off there is more like the easiest range of motion, and we're staying more or less in the hard part. We're staying in it more. So there's not that like little momentary reprieve at the top of the rep where you're like, I got there. And then you can take a breath and descend back down. It's like you get to wherever it's hardest and then you begin descending back down again. So we're using some of that, which I think is cool. I, of course, experimented with it on my own for a meso before I programmed it into your stuff. But I think there's utility for it and I like it. And it's another way that we can just very slightly try to bias things to the range of the motion that the research has been showing is the most productive.
Awesome. Yeah. And we talked about this too. We're not going like that's the only thing we're working on. You're just slowly adding it in and you're using it on certain exercises. And we talked about we're not also doing it on every single set for those exercises. It's also like towards the end. So I guess part of that is just experiment with it a little bit. And is that kind of how you ran it for yourself as well?
Yeah, I always would do one full range of motion set first. And that's always how we would do the partials after failure too. I would never have you do just failure plus partials or just a lengthened set or whatever. We would always do one full range of motion set to failure or close to failure. And then we would either do our lengthened set or our partials or stuff like that. And so I'm still like a huge fan of doing a full range of motion set. I think for a number of reasons, like we know that's been productive for decades upon decades of training. We know there might be some benefit to the short position orthopedically or for regional hypertrophy potentially. And so I think just ignoring the short position completely is probably not prudent. But we also know that the lengthened position is probably where more growth occurs. And so if we can middle that and get one set full range of motion that we can use almost as like standardization or diagnostics for progression, hey, is my first set improving? Because if that first set's improving, then it doesn't exactly matter that the next set may have this variable range of motion, like 60%, 70%, 55%. Like how far did you actually go in the range of motion? That's one of the biggest critiques of these lengthened sets is it's just so ambiguous where the range of motion actually ends. But I don't think it really matters is the end of the result. It's like you have that first set to full range of motion. That's your diagnostics. Then the second set is all about creating stimulus, and the muscle is just a dumb piece of meat. It only knows the stimulus that it's under, right?
Yep. Yeah, that was always a big thing for me is like realizing that your muscle's not smart. It doesn't know the exact weight you're using. It just knows the tension and things like that. But yeah, no, that makes sense to make sure that you're still training through that full range of motion. And then also too, I think I've talked about this with Milo too, but like that lengthened position probably is going to have a little bit more like stimulus with it. And so with that comes a little bit more fatigue. Whereas like the short positions, like you can still get a little bit of muscle growth, but it's like maybe that fatigue cost is a little bit less as well too, which is probably why you would still say, hey, let's leave some of that full range of motion in there.
Yeah. And there's potentially like metabolic aspects that are occurring at the short position when that muscle is contracted with all the cross fibering going on and stuff like that. And so I think it's just important to have your muscles experience that full range of motion and then bias a little bit toward the more lengthened range.
And it just sounds like this is a good way to get the best of both, right? Like you're incorporating some of this newer research, but you're not like going full into it to where it's, oh, we're only doing this and then completely omitting like the short position and stuff like that. So as far as like exercise selection goes with this, and for your training and mine, would this be something that you would? So you mentioned like face away cable curls were doing this. What about like back work? Is that something too that is going to be in, or would it not make as much sense for the back?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. The thing with the back is it would respond more similarly to the like hip extension and leg extension examples I use. So in back movements, because the hardest part of the movement is going to be when the hands get close to your torso, by omitting that hardest part of the movement, you'll be able to use a lot more weight in the back stuff. And so for strong people, sometimes that's just a practical issue of there not being enough weight. If your gym only goes up to 100-pound dumbbells and I want you performing dumbbell rows to 60% range of motion, I think you're probably going to need more than a 100-pound dumbbell. And so I've noticed the same with pull down stacks. Like I've been at pull down stations where I can do the full stack for 12 or 15 reps. What am I going to do if I want to do length and partials? So sometimes it's a practicality issue. for you specifically, actually, we've been working it in on your neutral grip pull downs for the entire cycle so far. So before we even introduced it for the arm movements this week, we had a cool superset where we went from straight arm pull downs, but given what we know about the lats being less active as the arm gets stretched overhead in that straight arm pull down, the lat is more active as the hand gets closer to the waist in the straight arm pull down. So that first movement, we're actually biasing the short position. So we're avoiding going all the way up to the stretch, and we're focusing that attention more on the part of the range where it's the contraction that's occurring. And then we're supersetting immediately to a neutral grip pull down, also lat focused, but this time we're not actually going to the short position at all. So this is like a cool new version of the classic short lengthened superset that I'm a huge fan of. Like I use this superset a lot with a dumbbell lateral raise into a behind the back cable lateral raise. Again, short lengthened superset. This straight arm pull down, focus on the short position, and then neutral grip pull down, focus on the lengthened position. I think it's a super cool concept. How's it experienced for you? What have you thought about it?
I was gonna say my freaking lats are on fire after it for sure. I think it gets hit a little bit more in the neutral grip pull down than in the pull over, or
Okay.
yeah, the pull over, but that could be a technique thing. But yeah, my freaking lats are on fire after that superset. So I like it. And two, I think with this, like, this is probably where I think there's probably a couple muscle groups where this like full range of motion thing probably actually hurt people's like growth a little bit. And I think the back's probably one, because it makes sense, because it's, if you do that full range of motion and it's, oh, hey, I'm not going to do any more because I can't get all the way down. It's like you are missing out on probably some growth there. So I would imagine that's probably been the biggest, like, from all this like lengthen research and stuff like that. I think like probably the delts in the back have probably been the two that probably have seen the most benefit from all this stuff.
I agree 100%, man. Yeah, because most people's initial choice for shoulders is a dumbbell lateral raise. That's just the most commonly performed movement that you see for the shoulders. And you could say the same thing about back slash rear delts slash lats. Like all of the movements that are chosen are super short overloaded. And I've tested this out just because I was curious, but I'll take a set of rows or pull downs to absolute failure concentrically till I can't get my hands to my waist anymore, and then just see how many more reps I can get until I can't move it anymore, just until you're stretched out and you can't actually even
Move it at all.
move it at all. And usually I can get 12 additional reps. And so that just like, it goes to show that there's a ton of range of motion for your back that's not being fully exhausted if you're just stopping the rep when you can't get your hands to your torso anymore.
Which is funny because the full range of motion thing was like, oh, people are just they're just doing too much weight. But it was like, honestly, almost they're probably training their back a little bit smarter than doing full range of motion there. I don't think they were doing it on purpose. I'm sure a lot of people were just doing it to just do more weight, but it actually ended up being a little beneficial for them.
Momentum in rows or whatever. Yeah.
Like momentum, like you just see people like half rep pull downs and stuff like that. And there might have been something to it. I think for me, that's been the biggest thing now when I'm like doing this partial range of motion. I'm like, feel like I'm that bro at the gym that's just doing too much weight, but there's obviously a reason behind it.
Yeah. And we do it strict and controlled. So it's like when you get a partial rep, you're not using momentum and still not getting there. You're like precisely executing a movement like a scientist.
Yeah, no, I love it. And definitely it's been really cool to add this stuff in and obviously work with you on it and you program it in, but also just see all the research come out on this stuff. Is there anything else that you wanted to hit on with that changed in terms of recently with your thoughts around this, or is that pretty much it on that?
Yeah, I think that covers it pretty well. My current thoughts on it.
Cool. So just real quick before we dive into your training, just a couple of thoughts. Just wanted to hear your thoughts and use this time to just ask you about my training. So we talked about, I'm going to be doing a cut here before my wedding, just drop some body fat. I've been in like a surplus and I haven't done like a conventional cut in a long period of time. You mentioned, hey, potentially dropping down to 4 days a week from 5. Just curious to hear your thoughts and maybe why you thought that and explain it maybe to the audience, why that's an option. And can you do that in fat loss phases and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think it just goes back to the idea of volume not being the primary driver of hypertrophy necessarily. This actually is relevant to our specialization talk and volume as well, and like how you construct a specialization cycle. So we'll get into all of that. But basically, I think that when you're in a cutting phase, and especially when you're in a cutting phase where you know that cutting already in itself is a stressful activity for the mind and the body, and then you add in the fact that you're going to be preparing for your wedding And I remember when that happened and all the times where I'd be like, man, I really need to either get this workout in or I need to do this work or write this program, but we have a food tasting or something like that. And I'm like, the last thing I want to do is go do the stupid food tasting right now. But you have to put on a happy face, like act like you're part of the experience. So in times like that, like it would stress me out a lot more if I knew that I was missing a workout because of this food tasting. And instead I'm like, hey, I'm on a 4-day program now. Like I allocated this extra day to be able to do things like this and have it not stress me out. I remember when I was preparing for my wedding, I actually went to a 3 times a week full body program. And that's also what I did when I had my first child. So I had a couple 6-month periods in a matter of 3 or 4 years where I would just train 3 times a week full body. And it was mostly like a pull and a leg hip movement. And that was it. I didn't really train arms. I just did the thing and focused on progressive overload. And I continued to make progress. So there's many ways to skin the cat. And I think that when you're not so hyper focused on volume and, oh my God, if I lower volume from 5 days to 4 days, I'm going to shrink and lose all the gains that I've been working for. Like once you can break out of that mindset and you can realize that, hey, I just got to work hard and focus for 3 or 4 sessions a week and I can maintain or even slightly progress throughout the cut in preparation for my wedding. It just provides you a lot of freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, again, me 10 years ago, 6 days a week, can't take any, maybe even 7 days, can't take any days off. And obviously it's been cool to see that, hey, like you don't necessarily have to do a ton and you can, again, dial it back to make sure that you're not overdoing it. Cause like you said, we only have so much stress that we can handle. So it's like you do too much and it's like something's going to suffer. And I think a lot of people forget that a cut itself being an energy deficit is a stressor on the body. So it's important to manage that. Cool. Just want to hear your thoughts on that. And I thought it'd be really insightful for the audience. So let's switch over to your training, man. Anything going on? Obviously you said you incorporate a little bit, some length and partials, Milo Wolf style, as you call it. But yeah, any other changes or anything with your training?
Yeah, I'm actually starting a new cycle on June 4th. So I have a new split. I was on the same split for, oh man, it was a long time, like over a third of a year, 2 55-day mesocycles with a deload in between. I'm switching it up, but before I switch it up, I'm getting blood work done. And I'm sure you probably saw this on my story yesterday, but I feel ignorant for this, but I honestly did not know that you're supposed to take 2 or 3 full rest days from the gym or like any intense activity prior to getting blood drawn. And I didn't know it. I don't know what else to say. Like I've been getting blood work done my whole life and no one ever told me that until this last like 2 or 3 months. 4 different people have told me that. And then I Googled it and Google confirmed the same thing. Yeah, you're not supposed to do intense activity before getting blood drawn. And apparently you can even have your liver enzymes, AST and ALT, you can have those affected for up to a week from lifting. Any signs of like oxidative stress, if you're looking at reverse T3, you're looking at uric acid as a sign of inflammation, or what other things? So the liver enzymes and the kidney enzymes, so the BUN and the GFR and creatinine and stuff like that. Those are all going to be elevated if you've trained close to your blood work. And so I am going to do blood work the right way this time. I'm going to train with weights up until Sunday or maybe Monday. I'm just doing like deload style training. So hopefully there's not too much muscle damage. And then I'm going to stop all cardio and all training Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday and get my blood work done Thursday morning. And yeah, I guess just do 10K steps a day and just keep it chill leading up to that, see what that comes out to be. But then I will be starting my new training cycle. And as usual, as Jeff, I like to have these weird splits that aren't your typical like upper lower or push pull legs or whatever. I got to be unique. So my Monday is hamstrings, lateral delts, and leg extensions. So you get a little bit of quad volume in there. Tuesday, I'm doing some VO2 max intervals, cardio stuff. Wednesday is upper body pull, so back and lats and triceps. And then I'm going to throw push-ups in as part of my tricep work so that I get a little bit of chest in there. Thursday is just some more cardio. Friday is quads, lateral delts, and leg curls so that I get a little hamstring volume in with my quads. Saturday is upper body pressing. So you're looking at shoulders and chest with biceps. And then I'm including pull-ups with the biceps so that I'll get a little bit of back work in there. And then Sunday is another cardio day. So one of the things aside from the split that's interesting about this approach for me is that I'm actually going to be doing cardio 5 or 6 days a week, along with training 4 days a week. And this is part of an ongoing experiment I've been doing. I think on the last time I was on your podcast, I alluded to the fact that I had a DEXA done in August and that I was going to get another one done in April. And just, it was, the purpose was for my one arm training experiment to see if I had gained or lost muscle in the arm that was trained and not trained. But the other kind of cool benefit of getting that DEXA was to see whether after 7 months of intense cardio, I had lost any muscle. And what the DEXA showed was that I gained 2.5 pounds and 0.8 of that 2.5 was lean tissue. So about a third, which is, I think, about as good as you could hope for at my level, whether doing cardio or not doing cardio. I think gaining almost a pound of lean mass in 7 months is pretty solid. And I'm pushing the boundary even further now. So I think before, for those 7 months, I was doing between 3 and 5 cardio sessions a week. Now I'm going to bump it up to 5 to 6 cardio sessions a week and see if I can continue to progress in the gym, maintain mass, maybe even build mass. We'll see. And so that's part of the experiment now. And as far as the specifics of my training, yeah, like I said before, I have those 3 movements where I'm going to be doing the Milo Wolf way of lengthened partials, establishing that 60 to 70% range of motion. And then the rest of my movements are going to be as they've been. For the back stuff, I'm still going to primarily be doing partials after failure and lengthen sets where I'll go to failure and then do partials. So yeah, no big changes on that. A couple new movements popped in just for keep things interesting for novelty. But for the most part, I pretty much train the same movements. And most of that's a product of having a home gym where I only have certain equipment. And so I just tend to always use the same equipment.
Awesome. Yeah. It seems like it's a little bit more lower body focus heavier, or is it just, or not? Or am I?
No, I don't
No.
think so. There's one hamstring day, but it has leg extensions on it. And then there's one quad day and it has leg curls on it. So I would say it's mostly pretty balanced. My last cycle I was doing was a quad and delt specialization. And the one before that was a hamstring specialization. And the hamstring specialization lasted for a year. And then I did the quad and delt specialization for 4+ months. So now, after basically a year and a half of specializing on various areas, I am just going back to much more of an even program. And the reason that I mentioned that I'm throwing pull-ups in on chest day and why I'm throwing push-ups in on back day is so that I can get just a little bit of chest on back day and a little bit of back on chest day, which allows me to still check that box for frequency twice a week without having to have 2 hard sessions for each muscle group. I have one session where 70 to 80% of the volume takes place and another session with 20 to 30% of the volume.
Awesome. Yeah. And then I guess something like pull-ups too is just going to be a good compound-ish exercise. That's probably going to be great you can get away with just doing a couple sets of that on a separate day too. What were some of the exercises that is it the similar ones to myself that you were putting in, or the ones you mentioned earlier for the lengthened, the Milo Wolf style ones?
Yeah, so the Milo Wolf style ones, I'm doing the leg extension on the day that I'm only doing leg extensions for quad work because I want to get the most bang out of that movement. So I'm doing lengthened partials on leg extensions. I'm doing lengthened partials on hip extensions, and I'm doing them on the dual cable lateral raise. So I just decided to do them on the dual cable and crossbody pushdowns. Those are the 2. So the crossbody pushdowns is actually an interesting one because the only reason that I decided to start doing them on that one is because I had injured my humerus on a bike fall a couple weeks ago. And for whatever reason, I could do almost every movement fine, but the short position, the lockout of the tricep extension, for some reason was just bothering me. And I realized that if I just cut that range of motion just shy of the short position, that it felt totally fine. And so I did a couple sets that way and it felt so good. And I realized that it's like back work with those cross cable pushdowns. It takes so much effort to get the last 2 inches of range of motion that it just felt more natural almost not to have to fight through that sticking point to get short every time and just be like, hey, when I hit that point where I can't go any further, I'll just hit and release. And that's the way I just kept thinking about it. And by spending more time with my triceps stretched and less time with them contracted, the sensation at the end of the set was so much better. And it didn't feel at all like it was affecting my joints. It was just very specifically targeted right at the tricep where I wanted it. And so I started doing it for that one. And then just the other day, I experimented with it for the dual cable lateral raise. So now I have it in for 4 movements in my upcoming cycle.
Yeah, with those crossbody tricep extension, definitely that last part is super challenging there. And did you say those are more like mid overload?
They are, yeah. And you can tell that because if you go to failure short and then you try to do partials, you can't get like 10 partials before you can't move anymore, like you would on a row or a pull down. What do you
Yeah.
find? I usually find like 3 or 4, and then I can barely move the thing anymore.
No, that's 100% true. Like I'll be doing it. I'm like, oh, like, dude, there's no way. I don't think there's any way I'm gonna be able to do this. And it's like that range of motion gets like super tiny. I feel like at the end,
Yeah.
it's like I feel like I'm barely freaking moving the thing at all.
And that's how you can tell where movements are overloaded. Because if you're doing it on a back squat and you go to the bottom and you try to do partials, there's no partials to have. So you know that one's lengthened overloaded. And then alternatively, if you did it on like a lateral raise or a seated cable row or a pull down, you can get, like I said, 12 reps maybe of partials. And then you look at something like that cross cable push down and you can get 3 or 4. So yeah, I think, that one, it depends also where your body is in relation to the cable. So if you get much closer to the cable, it's going to be more lengthened overloaded. And if you get further away from the cable, it's going to be more short overloaded. So you can manipulate that. And I've actually seen Cass do sets like that, where he'll step back and go to failure short. And then he'll take 2 or 3 steps forward and he'll be able to get 3 or 4 more reps because he's harnessing more of that like strength that exists in the length and range by getting closer. I've seen it on those. I've seen it on cross cable Y raises where you start further back and then you can take a step or 2 in and get some more reps. The same idea that we've done with the press arounds where you go to failure and then you can turn your torso face forward and get a couple more reps, just manipulating your body positioning in relation to the cable.
Yeah, that was super interesting on the press arounds because I was doing those and I was doing it where you had me switch at the end, but I was doing that the whole way and it was like pretty easy to get it. And you made me switch to where it was like I was more straight out and I had to come across more. Freaking made it way tougher to do it that way. And then, like you said at the end there, you're switching and going back the other way. So yeah, super interesting stuff. How you can just make those little changes like that and it manipulates so much there. Cool, man. Any other insights on your training, or do we hop into the specialization?
Yeah, let's hop into it, man.
Cool. Yeah. So I wanted to bring you on here because I'm in the middle of one and I know the guys at Data Driven Strength had kind of talked about this. And you said you've done it for a while too for certain body parts, but this concept of specialization phases. So I think first, let's just start with what are they? We'll start there and then we'll move forward with it.
Yeah. Specialization phase would just be you take a couple muscle groups that you want to prioritize and you manipulate a number of variables that we can discuss to essentially put more of your attention and focus on those areas.
So basically it's just, okay, a normal training program usually is split down the middle in terms of what you're going to work on. Whereas a specialization phase is you're going to just prioritize certain muscle groups during a training phase or however long you want it to be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there's like a number of different ways you can go about and some levers you can pull to make that happen.
Cool. Yeah, no, it's pretty simple. It's not this crazy explanation that you need to get into it. I guess the first thing would be like, maybe what would be the reasons to do a specialization phase?
A good question to start off. Yeah. Because a lot of times you get the question of, hey, I've been training 9 months. I really want to bring my glutes up. Should I do a glute specialization phase? And almost across the board, the answer to that question is no, you're 9 months into training, just grow everything. So there's definitely a point in your training where you're probably going to get into the late intermediate stage just before would be considered advanced, where you start noticing progress slow down. Like you're still making pretty good progress. Maybe your progress is monthly now instead of weekly, but you're still able to make progress. You're still gaining lean body mass. You're still seeing body composition improvements. And it's usually at that point where you will realize that you have either biased your training unintentionally in the earlier years, and you have some sort of body parts that stand out over other body parts, or simply you just have a genetic predisposition to have certain body parts be larger than other body parts. And so once you reach that point where you've been training on what you believe was an even program for quite a while, and you're starting to see, I don't want to call them imbalances, because at some level, like specialization is the desire to create an imbalance of sorts. But maybe it's bringing up a lagging body part. There's 2 ways you could specialize, right? You could specialize in, hey, this is a strong body part. I want to make it stronger. Like girls with big glutes that are like, I just want bigger. Or like maybe it is a lagging body part and you're like, hey, my glutes are fine, like they look great, but my back could use work. It doesn't seem to be up to par with my glutes. And so now you create a back specialization cycle. A number of different reasons why you might want to do it, but I think at the end of the day, you generally want to wait to do one until you are at that point in your training journey where you have enough muscle to even assess what might be a weak area.
Yeah, you want to make sure you take some time to just train everything pretty evenly. And like you said, then at that point, you can see what maybe genetically what is more advanced or what needs a little bit more attention. But to go straight into one is probably not going to be great there. And so you mentioned some reasons you want to do one would be if you have a lagging body part. So again, if something like your chest is lagging, you want to focus on that, which I would imagine most guys go into. If you're a guy, you probably don't underdo chest, I would imagine, but maybe you do. Maybe it's like a recovery thing where you're doing too much of other muscle groups or something like that. But also, I think another thing that you could potentially do it as well, and you may have hit on this, but like way to progress as an advanced person as well. If you are at that limit of you can't really just continue to do more volume, you do have to back off certain areas. And so this can be a way to get some more progression out of certain muscle groups that you wouldn't otherwise would if you just train everything evenly.
Yeah, quite possibly. The mention of volume is an interesting one, though. And the reason being that I'm not fully convinced that manipulating volume is like the first lever to pull on a specialization phase anymore. I think if you would have asked me this 3 or 4 years ago, maybe even 2 years ago, I probably would have pulled the lever on volume first. And I'm actually looking at an outline right now of a specialization cycle that I wrote about 3.5 years ago. And the first thing that I wrote was volume. That was the main lever to pull. It was maintenance muscle groups at 6 to 10 muscle sets a week and specialized muscle groups at 12 to 20 sets a week. And I don't necessarily think that is wrong. I just don't think it's any more the first move. It wouldn't be number one on my checklist.
Cool. Yeah, no, and I'm sure we'll dive into what those levers are and things like that. But yeah, that's interesting. And I'm curious to hear what those are. But yeah, so those would be the reasons why you'd want to do one. Again, you do want to make sure that you don't go straight into this. You should train everything evenly. But I do want to. So do you think you already do this in a way? Because I would imagine some of these levers that you're going to pull already do this. But you feel like you do this for like men and women already, like where you put a little bit more focus on, again, generally lower body for women, generally upper body for men. So it's like, yeah, we say train everything evenly, but I would imagine that maybe you already do this when you make programs out anyways, in a way.
Yeah, I would say less on the lower body, upper body discrimination and more on the more glutes for women and more chest for men and less chest for women. Cause that seems to be like a very common thing I experience with women. And I don't know if it's just because we're in the fitness space, but there is such a large number of women that I work with that have implants. And almost every doctor across the board now seems to be telling these women that they shouldn't train chest anymore. It's not even, hey, just do some light push-ups and then when you feel better, you can go back to training chest. It's literally, hey, you have no reason to train chest anymore. It's like the phrasing that's being used with them. And so these women come to me and they're legitimately like scared of training chest because they think it's going to completely mess up their implants. So when I write programming now, I do include chest work because there's obviously plenty of women that don't have implants, but most of the programming that I write geared more toward women will have one chest movement on each upper body day, where it will have 2 delt movements, 2 back movements, and generally the leg days will have at least 1 glute movement. Whereas for guys, I'll generally just let the glutes be trained by hip hinging and squatting and not really have to specialize or even not have to use any specific isolated movements for the glutes.
Yeah, no, that's a good point you bring up. Typically the chest and then, like you said, glutes, because I very rarely, unless again somebody specifies, hey, I want to work on glutes. For men, I typically don't program any direct glute work because, like you said, you hit it through squats. Really, any of your lower body stuff, you're probably hitting glutes at least a little bit on most things. But I figured that was something where it's like, again, when you program for men versus women, you already do this, even if you don't technically call it a specialization phase. Cool. Again, just to sum it up so far, again, lagging body part, ways to progress as an advanced person potentially. But again, we don't want to just go straight into a specialization phase. Is there anything we missed out on, like the prereq or anything like that before we dive into the levers?
No, I think you covered it pretty well.
Cool. All right. So yeah, let's dive into like how to program for it. And I have some other couple follow-up questions, but I know you want to talk about the levers that you can pull and things like that. So
Yeah, for sure. So the very first one that I put on here that I think takes dominance over everything else is exercise order within the training day. And this probably seems pretty obvious to most people. Hey, if you're specializing on legs, you should probably do legs while you're fresh. You don't want to go do chest, back, and shoulders and then throw legs in as an afterthought at the end. And so, yeah, whatever your, not just your main muscle group focus, but whatever your movement is that is going to most either bias that muscle group or be your diagnostic tool for the cycle. Whatever are the movements that are the most important for you to develop the area that you're trying to specialize on should be performed first in each training session. And that's even aside from whether specialization day. Like for you with your program, we have days that are just delts and back. And so every exercise is a specialization exercise, so to speak. So therefore, we then have to decide like which ones are the priority ones that are going to go first. And I think on at least one of your days, we have shoulder stuff first. And on another one of your days, we have back stuff first. We flip-flopped it that way because we're specializing on both areas. Second is proximity to failure. And so this is another one that we actually see laid out in your programming pretty clearly. When we look at the leg volume that you're doing, much of that leg work is further from failure. And then much of the work on your delts and your back is going to be closer to failure. And some of that is a product of it being the delts in the back, like you and I discussed in the beginning. Some of that is just those muscle groups are more conducive to training closer to failure because of the short overload nature of them. But part of that also is just purposeful because we're trying to specialize on those muscle groups. And so we're going to pull the lever of working closer to and beyond failure on those areas. The next lever to pull I put was decreasing volume on the non-specialized areas. And so I think that one has to be before raising volume on the specialized areas, because one thing that we seem to find, at least anecdotally across the board, is that if you lower volume down on an area, that just opens up more recovery capacity for you to optimize your results on the other areas. So that's separate of you having to actually increase volume on those areas. Like literally just by decreasing volume on a different area, the other area that you're trying to focus on will increase. And we actually saw this a couple times anecdotally. I've heard Eric Helms talk about cycles where he'll have powerlifters that get injured and they can't perform one of their movements. So the perfect example would be a powerlifter gets injured and can't perform squats or deadlifts for a few weeks. So they're just really bench pressing. And literally the bench press will explode through the roof. And they're not necessarily even doing extra bench press volume. They just no longer are carrying the fatigue from the squat or the deadlift that into their bench press work. And so that's a perfect example. And I think that it plays out very similarly in hypertrophy training. Another one that I like to pull is frequency. And that's, again, we'll see that played out with your program where we have delts and back 3 times a week. And then all the rest of the muscle groups are either 1.5 or 2 times a week. And so frequency, I think, is a really great one too, especially if you're choosing muscle groups that tend to recover relatively quickly. So like in your case, delts and back very rarely get sore. I don't think you've ever actually mentioned on your check-in report that your delts and back are sore. And we're actually like specializing on them.
Well, real quick, if I can stop you, it's funny.
Yeah.
The muscles that get most sore, like for example, chest, hamstrings, quads, like all stuff that we dialed back on.
Yeah. I don't know. So there's 2 possible reasons for that. One could be that maybe those are just fast twitch dominant muscle fibers for you. And so they just carry fatigue more, which I think is probably pretty likely. But it could also be that you're just like genetically what am I trying to say? You're genetically predisposed to need less volume in those areas. And the movements might be more lengthened, overloaded that we tend to use, a number of reasons. But what that does is that kind of complicates the production of a specialization cycle if you want to specialize on a body part that tends to take a lot of damage. So imagine if everything was flipped for you and we were like, you know what, we're going to specialize on hamstrings and chest this cycle. Then the way that we design this cycle is probably not going to be to pull the lever of frequency, because how many times a week can we train hamstrings if you're getting sore for 2 or 3 days after, right? Same with chest. And we're not even doing that much volume for them right now. So I think in the case of that, we have to pull the lever of exercise selection, which was the next one up on my list, because exercise selection allows you to choose movements that are less damaging. Yeah. And so because we're not specializing on hamstrings and chest this cycle, I'm purposefully giving you movements that are more damaging because I want to get more out of less. But if we were specializing on hamstrings and chest, we would have to do a lot more cable-based chest work. Not that we're not doing that already, but like I have you doing a superset specifically to cause muscle damage. And for hamstrings, we would do a lot more of our work with a 45-degree hip extension and with leg curls, and a lot less with RDLs. So that lever can be pulled depending on what muscle groups are being targeted, et cetera. And then the final lever I wrote was to increase volume of the areas that you're trying to specialize on. And so there you go. That's number 6 on my list now. But like I opened with 3 or 4 years ago, it would have been number 1 on my list.
Yeah, no, I love that, because I think when people hear specialization phase, they're automatically just, oh, hammer away at the volume on that. And if you pull some of these levers and you increase volume, you're going to be you might be doing too much for that muscle group. And you're going to probably get the opposite effect that you want here in the specialization phase, right? Because you can probably overdo this where it's like you just do too much, and now you're trying to specialize in certain muscle groups, but now you're just doing so much. You're trying to pull too many levers at one time, and now you're overtraining in that muscle group.
Yeah, we see this a lot actually with people that are like following one of the group programs and they're doing everything. And the group programs are written mostly, yes, they're geared at females. So like we discussed, they'll have a little less chest work, a little more glute work, but constantly we'll have somebody be like, I want to build my glutes up more. Can I add XXX to the program each week? And I'm like, maybe if you want to subtract X from the program, but their initial inclination isn't to think I should take something away to add something. It's to just think I should do more, because that's what's ingrained in like our mentality is, hey, more is better, better, better. And it's cool that we're starting to get research that shows that it's actually more of a U-shaped curve, and that there is a point where you can do too much and actually get worse results.
Yeah, which I think back to for myself, when I first started training, I was like, that's always like the main thing. And so it was like, dude, I was just freaking hammering chest, but I never like changed. Maybe I did less legs because it was just like, hey, the leg aspect of it. But it's like, I was just hammering away at chest, and I never took any of these things into consideration. And I probably slowed down because just like we just talked about, like, obviously you're choosing exercises that are going to get me more stimulus, but I obviously don't need a ton of chest work, I feel like, to really see that. And if you just hammer away, it's just like, you're going to do too much. So couple questions on some of these things. So I love it. I think the exercise is a big one, right? So I think maybe where people misapply this is they have that thought process of, oh, I need to do my compound lifts, my heavier stuff first. And so if somebody wants to grow like their arms or delts or something, it's like they can misapply this by always just throwing those things at the end of their workout and not getting them early. Is that something that you commonly see there with that as well?
Yeah, for sure. And I resonate and I empathize with that mentality, because I feel the same way in some ways. It, to me, seems like it would be silly for you to do your bicep and tricep work and then go do your back and chest work. To me, that just seems like you're not going to have a successful back and chest workout because your arms are going to be such a limiting factor. And so in the case of someone that would want to specialize on arms, I tend to want to put a specialized arm day in there.
Interesting.
And so have one day that's strictly arms, and then we would have arm sprinkled in on other days. But maybe in that case, you would break the rule of it always being first. And maybe it's okay if it's second. Another way of approaching that would be maybe it's you pair back with triceps, and then that way you can specialize on triceps and it won't really affect your back work. And maybe you pair chest with biceps because you can specialize on biceps and that won't really impact your chest work. So there's a number of kind of different ways that you can organize that.
You could also, and again, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you could also potentially do it where it's like, you could count like some of your pulling back work towards the bicep as well too. Obviously it's not direct bicep work, but you're probably going to get a little stimulus from that as well. So you could consider, right?
Yeah, so no, that's a great point. And it actually reminds me of like how back in the day when I was doing bro splits, I don't know, I was just intuitively thinking in my head that, hey, if I pair back with triceps and I pair chest with biceps, then I'm essentially getting chest work twice a week and I'm getting back work twice a week, because on bicep day, I'm going to do pull-ups, and on the chest bicep day, I'm going to do pull-ups. So I'm still going to get some back work in. And then I'm going to make sure I do push-ups or dips on the tricep day so that I still get some chest work in. And then effect, I'm hitting the muscle group twice a week. And so, yeah, like you have to count some of that volume towards it. And it's actually a cool way when you specialize to be like, there is going to be that auxiliary stimulus. And so you don't necessarily, you could have 3 arm days, but one of them is all compound movements. One of them is just an arm day. And then one of them is like some other volume sprinkled in.
Yeah. And so like basically in that scenario you just brought up, I mean, you were technically training, it was a bro split, but you were technically like still training chest a couple times a week, even though you didn't really, it wasn't direct chest day. Yeah. Cool. And then proximity to failure. So again, with that, it's just, you could just drop how like intense you're training on the muscle groups that you don't. For example, legs, we put lower on the priority list. So here for what we've been doing there is you're just, that RIR is a lot higher throughout the mesocycle there with that.
Yep, exactly.
And then one other question too on the frequency. So you said obviously bringing that up, but also again, paying attention to the muscle group, right? Something like like certain muscle groups are going to be a little bit tougher to increase that frequency. Again, all these kind of play a role. So it's like, if you do increase the frequency, you also probably are going to mess around with exercise selection to make sure it's not, you're recovering, because that's obviously the most important thing there. But with the frequency thing, is that something where if you're, say you're specializing in delts or something like that, would you train that first every single time? Or would it be like, hey, maybe the twice a week we're placing delts first and then later in the session, like on that third day or something like that?
Yeah, delts are a lot like arms in the sense that compound movements also hit them. So you can be doing a back day and that can hit a ton of rear delts, even though you're not intending on hitting rear delts. And like when you look at the EMG data on a lat pull down, like one where your elbows are coming in close to your side, the rear delt is still the most active, despite the fact that you're trying to bias lats. So with rear delts, yeah, those get hit through back work. We know that front delts get hit through chest work. So if I were designing a specialization cycle for delts, I would almost exclusively try to focus most of that volume onto the lateral delts, and then just assume that the rear delts and the front delts are going to get hit through compound movements. And then if that specific client, say, had lacking rear delts or lacking front delts, which I think is rarer than having lacking side delts, which seems to be more common. But if that were the case, then yeah, you would pull the lever and you would add some rear delt or front delt volume to one of those delt days as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. You're hitting the rear delts with chest or back, and then front delts with chest. So the focus is mostly on the side delts there with that. Cool. And then decreasing volume. I think that's huge. I think people overlook that aspect of it. Again, like in my example, it's like legs are super responsive to training. So it's like you might as well just drop down the volume on that muscle group. And again, I think that's going to take time for you to figure out what that is for you over time. And then obviously exercise selection, I think that's a big one too, figuring out which exercises give you more soreness. And again, obviously understanding which ones work more in the lengthened position, where that's overloaded at, is important there. And then lastly, increasing volume if you need to as a last resort thing there with it. So I guess a couple questions that don't relate to that, but so how long would you typically say, I guess, depending on the situation, it's like, if legs are like, if a certain muscle group is more responsive, it's like you could technically be in a specialization phase really as long as you need to or want to. There's probably no limit to how long you can be in one. But what do you typically find here with that?
Yeah, I can't believe I specialized on my hamstrings for a year. That, like, in retrospect, I remember when it started, and then I remember a year later still being like, yep, still specializing on hamstrings. So I don't think there is necessarily an end date in sight aside from what you can psychologically and physiologically handle. I know from people that specialize on arms, a lot of times elbow tendonitis is the thing that gets them primarily eventually. I could see quads causing some like knee issues if you're constantly sending the knees over the toes and doing a bunch of leg extensions under heavy load. I think like my knees feel better than they've ever felt in the last few years because of technique and exercise selection and all that stuff. But I could definitely see that being an issue if, say, volume and intensity and frequency was all increased. Yeah, I don't even know where I was going with that. What was the question again?
Just how long would you typically say?
Oh, yeah.
So again, it sounds like obviously you pay attention to your recovery is going to be the big thing there. Psychological side of it as well too.
I think Berto is actually a permanent lifelong specialization cycle for his back and arms, I think, are what he's focusing on. So as far as I know, for the last 12 to 18 months, that's what he's been prioritizing. And he's now training only 3 days a week. And he has 2 upper body days and 1 lower body day. And that's just what he's been rolling with since his contest prep ended in December, November, or whatever that was. And it was even And then before that, he was still specializing on the same muscle groups. It just wasn't a 3-day-a-week split. So yeah, I mean, there's a number of ways to go about it, but he's obviously found, much like you, that his legs respond fine with lower volumes, lower frequencies, etc.
Yeah, so my example, I'll probably, unless something happens where it's, damn, I've really been losing, like I'll probably stay on like my main maintenance volume for legs or something like for extended period of time. But I guess in terms of what you actually specialize on, like again, if you have certain body parts that you're like less concerned about, you can probably keep those down and just see where you can divvy up that extra recovery if you want to, or you could just train a little bit less. And again, maybe you go through periods of time where you do specialize in like delts or something like that, and then do that for a little bit. And you can always drop back down, and you have a lot of room to, it sounds like you have a lot of wiggle room here. And again, paying attention to recovery and whatnot's going to be most important. So do you need to be in a like building phase or at least maintenance for this? Or say you go into a fat loss phase, is it a good idea to even things out a little bit more? What does that look like?
It's a good question. I don't know that I have a firm opinion on this. I think, like anything, you're going to gain more if you're in a surplus for sure. But just because you're in a deficit, like, I don't necessarily think that you can't put a little bit more of your energy toward a specific muscle group. This would be a situation where I'd be even less likely to pull the volume lever than I already am. But I think that for sure, you can pull the proximity to failure lever. You can decrease volume for the strong muscle groups when you're in a cut, because we know maintenance volume is going to be so low anyways. You can lower, in your example, you could lower leg volume even more to allow you to continue hammering and focusing on the areas that you want to improve on, even in a cut.
Yeah. So again, I don't really see anything to where it would be like, hey, you need to make these drastic changes between fat loss and building. Again, just monitor your recovery and how you're progressing. Again, is going to be the big thing there.
Yeah, you may just pull different levers, like they may be in a different order.
Right. Cool. Any other things like for to look out for, or like maybe any other misapplications of this concept to wrap it up?
I would just be cautious of exercise selection when you're doing it, because we've alluded to this a bunch. We've actually straight up pinpointed on it that the hamstrings and the chest for you are muscle groups that get really sore. And so you just, if you wanted to specialize in those muscle groups, which it doesn't seem like you need to because they're very responsive, which is maybe also why they get really sore. But if somebody wanted to specialize in an area that tends to be easily damaged, you just need to take significantly extra precautions around that. And exercise selection is probably going to be the main lever you need to pull in that situation. I think depending on the muscle group that you're specializing on, there's just different parameters that probably need to be considered.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's awesome, man. Cool. I think there's a good summary of this topic. Again, I think it's like we said, it's almost, I feel like people are going to probably do some of these at some point anyways, and probably already do when they get started, just like we talked about the difference between men and women there on that. Cool. Anything else on your end on this topic?
The last thing I'd say is just to give props to the data-driven strength guys, because they also, as you said in the beginning, have been on the specialization idea train for hypertrophy. And they've put forth the idea that you could potentially just always be on a permanent specialization, like maybe a third body specialization, and it just rotates. So you're doing like a third of your body for 6 months, and then another third of your body for 6 months, and another third of your body for 6 months, and then repeat over. And potentially the rationale there being that maintenance volume or maintenance effort or just maintenance in general is so low that you can put more focus and energy into the areas in a certain area of your body to improve. And then when you dial back the effort, intensity, volume, frequency on it, it should maintain, and you can keep those gains until the next time that it comes around in the specialization sequence. And so just that as a general framework or concept has been interesting to me and something that I've been thinking about.
I think also that's probably a good way to, you said, we talked about how long to do this. And one of them was like, hey, you might run into some issues around like joint pain, stuff like that. That's probably a good way to also manage that if you need to as well too. So yeah, super interesting stuff, and wanted to get you on here to chat about it. So great information, man. Anything coming out on your end here soon that you want to lead the audience to or anything like that?
The new cycle on Bryan's program starts June 4th. I don't know if this podcast will be out by then. We usually operate a few weeks behind that. Yeah, that I don't think I have a whole lot more other than that. Check out the programs, Paragon Training Methods, Instagram, Bryan Boorstein, podcast, Eat, Train, Prosper. And that's all the things.
Cool. All right, man. We'll make sure we put all that stuff in the show notes, and then we'll obviously get you back on here again. I know now you said you got a goal. One of your goals for the rest of the year is to make sure you're on here more than Jordan Lips. So just got to get you we got to get you on a couple more times throughout. So as always, man, appreciate it. And yeah, we'll talk to you next time.
Sounds good.